Hello mech warriors, and welcome back to the Mech Lab, where we try to be a better mech commander every day. Today's video will be going over a bunch of optional rules from the various Battletech supplements that I think most people should be using all the time. In my opinion, these help to balance the game a little bit better and make things generally more interesting. This covers everything from rebalancing some weapons, to the way that units move, to the way that initiative works. So we're going to start off with weapons, and one of my favorites is the flamers per BMM. This makes it so that flamers do damage and heat at the same time. Flamers are arguably a pretty bad weapon overall. They do a lot less damage than a medium laser, which is the same tonnage and heat. So this makes them actually viable. All you Firestarter fans out there, rejoice, this rule is for you. Keep in mind that this is really brutal with any kind of battle armor that has flamers on it, because 4 or 5 of these things firing, that starts to rack up the heat real quick. Next we have Gauss. I love the idea that Gauss can be powered up or down. If you have a mech that has a bunch of energy weapons that it wants to use at close range, it makes sense that the mech warrior would power down the Gauss rifle so that it doesn't explode if it gets hit. And it also makes a lot of sense that you would shut it off if you don't have any ammo left. 2 things here for LRMs. Indirect fire should just always be on. I think that you should always allow it, but one thing that I really like is the unofficial rule that you can do indirect fire even if enemies are in line of sight. Essentially, you just launch your LRMs into the air and let the guidance system take over, rather than the direct guidance system of your mech. It can be really good if the enemy has like some smoke or forests in front of them. It lets you ignore those penalties, so it makes LRMs a little bit better. I also do like the cluster hit penalties and bonuses for all missiles, but this does make SRMs pretty brutal at close range, and it makes pretty much every missile weapon a fair bit worse at long range, something that you can definitely consider. I really love the rapid fire autocannons rule, and I like to turn on the unofficial rapid fire autocannon rule as well. This makes autocannons less accurate, but the TAC Ops rapid fire rules make it so that your autocannon might explode, which is potentially very hazardous. And I also really like the idea that you can unjam your ultra autocannons. I think that this should just be a standard rule. It doesn't make sense to me that racks can be unjammed, but ultra autocannons can't. I also love the increased autocannon damage unofficial rule. 1 extra damage for AC2s and AC5s doesn't really fix them, but it at least gives them a little bit of something to push them in the right direction. Be aware that stacking this with the ultra autocannon rules might make them a little bit too strong potentially, especially because these 2 weapons specifically have extremely low battle value. Burst fire machine guns are another excellent optional rule, in my opinion. Allow players to make the choice when they fire. I don't think that this unbalances anything at all. Essentially, you roll 1d6. Machine guns now do that amount of damage, that amount of heat, and 3 times that amount of ammunition. So potentially they do actually less damage, but on average they're going to do a little bit more, and it makes machine guns a little bit more viable, especially those designs that have like 1 or 2 of them. They're basically just a way to put a bomb in your torso. So I really like this on stuff like the Vulcan or Thunderbolt, the OG Battlemaster. All of those greatly benefit from this rule. And even if you have like a machine gun boat that has tons of them, the fact that it produces quite a bit of heat balances them out. Last thing that I didn't really know where to put is firing while prone from TAC Ops. I really like this rule, being able to fire your chest-mounted weapons even when you have one of your arms blown off and you're prone. It just lets you keep your mech in the fight for a little bit longer, and the penalty to hit is a fair trade-off. Next, let's talk about some initiative rules. First one, super obvious, you should always use this front-loaded initiative. I cannot stress this enough, you need to have front-loaded initiative on. When someone is already outnumbered, say you have 3 mechs to their 1, and you get to move 1 unit, and then they move 1 unit, and then you have your last 2 units moving, that is just way too big of an advantage. Especially if there's someone who really likes to spam a bunch of infantry and use them as initiative sinks, that can get really, really obnoxious. Speaking of, I also really love this one. Basically, infantry don't count for movement initiative, or infantry moves after that player's other units. So essentially your infantry won't count for your initiative because they're so small and insignificant compared to everything else that's on the table. This makes a lot of sense for me. It prevents infantry spam abuse for initiative syncing so that you can get massive blanks off. I think that this is a good rule to have if you don't have a unit limit. If you're limiting units to 4 to 6 already, this might not be necessary. Simultaneous rules are pretty interesting. I like simultaneous deployment phase because what it does is it makes it so that your deployment is determined before you see where any enemy units are. So it prevents you from counter-deploying. So that's kind of a double-edged sword. I like the ability to counter-deploy because it's strategic, but at the same time, counter-deploying can be kind of annoying, especially on a bigger map where your sensors wouldn't see where the enemy mechs are. I just think that this might be the way to go if you want to maybe keep things a little more random with your deployment. This is especially important if you're using blind drop. Basically, this is only for Mega Mech. It makes it so that you can't see the enemy units in the lobby. So if I added a unit in here, my opponent wouldn't be able to see it until we get into game. Can be pretty important for preventing counter-pick play. Lastly, I think this is really smart. Initiative streak compensation is a great unofficial rule. Essentially, it makes it so that if you win initiative a bunch of times in a row, the enemy starts getting a bonus to their initiative rolls until they beat you. Whether you're playing in Mega Mech or on tabletop, I think this is a great rule to make it so that one person doesn't just win initiative every single turn and win the game because of it. I talked more extensively about other ways to keep games more fair between players in my video about competitive Battletech. Go check that out if you want some more information on why I think that this is so important. Alright, next up let's talk about some movement rules. I really like the careful stand rules. Essentially it lets your mech stand up very carefully. You don't get any movement, but you get a -2 to your PSR to stand up. This is really important if your mech has like gyro or leg damage. It can mean the difference between getting your mech to be able to stand up and just staying on the ground forever. I also really like sprinting. Sprinting is basically you just focus on moving all out. You get to move at double your walk speed, but you don't get to fire any of your weapons. And there's also a penalty to your TMM, if I remember correctly. So this is a great rule if you want to be able to exploit the speed of units more and be able to move them into position. It's really great if you plan on doing lots of like flanks and using terrain to stay out of line of sight. So you're not necessarily even using your weapons anyways. You just want to move your mechs into position to get a flank off. I also like the idea that mechs can jump down more than 2 levels. They do have to make a PSR or else they're gonna fall down and take some damage. But I love the leaping TAC Ops rules. I think that it's really heroic and thematic to have your mech jump down like 4 levels and potentially just like break its legs, but you're willing to take that risk because you really need to get down that mountain to go and help your lance mates. I think that's a really cool rule. It also prevents mechs from getting like a bunch of their jump jets crit out and getting stuck on a high mountaintop that they jumped onto. Speaking of jump jet mechs, people who have played against like 7 or even 10 jump mechs know that jump mech plus heavy woods equals pain. When you can get 6 effective TMM, your mech is almost unhittable most of the time, depending on what you're facing. Like a standard pilot with 4 gunnery is gonna run and have 6, and then you have 6 to hit you. That's a 12. It's almost impossible to roll a 12 on 2 dice. It happens very infrequently. So just making jumping mechs cautious about going into those heavy woods is good in my opinion. So I like this rule a lot as a way to balance jumpy mechs. So TAC Ops backwards movement is really interesting. It makes it much harder to back up onto elevation, which makes a lot of sense. Like moving backwards with a mech is probably not very easy. I don't know if you've ever tried to climb the stairs backwards, but that's not easy even just with your regular feet. It makes disengaging a little bit more difficult, and I think it just adds a lot of flavor to the game. Pushing off the map. For objective games, I think that it's probably a good idea, and it also discourages snipers from just humping the edge of the map, because if someone charges you and they succeed on their charge, they will push you off the map and your mech counts as destroyed. It's no longer in the area of engagement. But it's also not super thematic. Like, if someone pushes you off the map, you aren't instantly removed from the scenario. It's not like the edges of the map are all just a big canyon that you fall into. So I don't like it thematically, I like it for tactical play and objectives. Now let's talk about dealing some damage. First of all, taking damage with the Tac Ops rules is really good in my opinion. Essentially, every 20 damage after the first adds +1 to the piloting skill roll required. I think this is a great rule. If you alpha strike a mech with a whole bunch of yours, it should definitely fall over. Like, imagine if you get hit with 2 Gauss rifles and an LRM-15 and a bunch of lasers. I mean, your mech is going to be so off balance, it's going to be almost impossible for you to stay standing. So I highly recommend this one. Great rule to have in effect. It makes alpha striking and focus firing a mech even better than it already is, and helps you to ensure that you get that knockdown. Keep in mind that it does nerf DFAs and charges, because if you get knocked over, they automatically fail. So if you want to encourage DFAs and charges, you shouldn't use this rule. And come on, who doesn't love a good death from above? Floating criticals. This is a really good one, in my opinion. It makes it so that through armor criticals don't just like automatically hit your torso, because most of the time, through armor criticals without this rule are going to absolutely just cripple you. They're just gonna knock out your gyro or your engine, and your mech is done. With this, it has a chance of hitting another location, and maybe you get like a leg crit, or hey, I mean, maybe it hits an ammo bin and it's even worse, but that's going to be unlikely. Virtually every Battletech player that I've ever talked to has said that floating criticals is a good idea. I also really like this unofficial rule where your primary target doesn't have to be in your front arc, because a lot of mechs have their primary weapon in an arm. So if I want to fire my large laser that's in my arm with my Thunderbolt at something behind me, I should be able to prioritize that targeting instead of the targeting of like the 3 medium lasers and the SRM-2 that I'm firing at a mech that's in front of me. I guess it makes sense that there would be more like cameras and targeting sensors and stuff on the front of the mech, but I like being able to say which one I want to focus on. Maybe I'm taking manual control of that large laser and looking at the targeting reticle through like a monitor or something. Meanwhile, I'm letting my computer targeting just say, okay, that Atlas that's 90 meters away, just launch all forward-facing weapons at that, and meanwhile, I'm personally targeting that large laser behind me. So that's going to cover all of my recommended optional rules. There are some in here that I like that I didn't recommend because they're a real pain, such as starting fires and smoke movement, fires spreading, that kind of stuff. That's all really hard to track at the table. I do recommend a lot of these rules for use in Megamech because the computer just handles it all for you. Although I will say that if you have a lot of fires and a lot of smoke going on, it can cause the program to chug a little bit. Let me know what your favorite optional rules are, or if you disagree that everyone should be using all of these rules, let me know which one you don't think is good and why. I'd like to thank everyone for helping me to get to 1,500 subscribers. This is a fantastic accomplishment for the channel. Really appreciate all the support, everyone. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Really helps out the channel. Thanks for stopping by, Mech Warriors, and have a great day.